Hello students, this week's lecture is on the cell, basic unit of life. It will cover two chapters from the two books that I've been using, Concepts of Biology, and that's going to be chapter 3, and some of the material from chapter 4, Biology, second edition. Now, they correspond to each other. You just find more details in the Biology second edition book. Again, use the PowerPoint as a guide to, to know what I expect you to know and take notes on. Recall there's a hierarchy to life. And so we saw in last chapter, last lecture, that we have molecules that make up organelles, organelles that make up cells. So we explored already molecules. We're now down to the cell, the basic unit of life. Now cells come together to form tissues, so they're going to have a similar function. We have several tissues that will make up an organ. Organ working with alongside other organs will make up an organ system, and the coordinated effort of an organ system will maintain homeostasis in one organism. And so we're at the cellular level. We'll continue in the cellular level for several lectures. We'll explore the cell in this lecture, the cell structure, the organelle function. And then next lecture, we'll look at cell division and how the cells replicate. From there, we'll go on into the inner functions of the cell, protein synthesis, cellular respiration, etc. And we'll end the semester with ecology, and so looking at populations and communities, and finally our Earth biosphere. So let's explore the cell. We call the cell theory. The cell theory states that cells are the basic unit of life. They're the fundamental units of life. They carry all functions necessary to show life. Those are the characteristics of living organisms. Every form of life on Earth is either a cell, so made up of one cell, unicellular, or composed of many cells. We call those multicellular organisms. And then cells come into existence only through the activity of other cells. Cells come from pre-existent cells. So here we have three examples of cells. We have epithelial nasal cells. So this is found in the nasal cavities, sinus cavities. Then we have plant cells. And so you could usually tell the structure of plant cells because they have very geometric, rigid structure. And then here on the right, we have bacterial cells. And so if we look at the scale, we can see that the epithelial cells are 10 micrometers, that's a millionth of a meter. The plant cells are bigger here at 50 micrometers. And when we're looking at bacterial cells, we're looking at here in the measurement of nanometer. That's 10 to the negative 9 or billionth of the meter. So we see that cells come in a variety of sizes. In this image, we could also see there are a variety of shapes, and that we have three different types of organisms that make up cells. We have from prokaryotic organisms to eukaryotic animal cells and plant cells, eukaryotic cells. So let's look into more about cells. So what do eukaryotic animal and plant cells have in common with prokaryotic cells? All cells have a cell membrane. We call this also the plasma membrane. And the plasma membrane separates everything inside the cell, intracellular environment, from everything outside the cell, extracellular environment. So we have that cell membrane. And then here it's labeled cell wall, but animal cells, eukaryotic cells do not have a cell wall, so we'll say cell membrane. And then inside the cell, we have what's known as cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is the space between the cell membrane and the nucleus or central area where you would find DNA. And the cytoplasm will find cytosol, which is the semi-liquid component of the cell, where you'll have other organelles or structures suspended in it. All cells have in common some genetic material like DNA. And then lastly, we have organelles that synthesize proteins, and these are called ribosomes. A side-by-side comparison of prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells, we see that they both have DNA. However, in prokaryotic cells, the DNA spread throughout much of the cell. And then in eukaryotic cells, the DNA is organized inside a structure called the nucleus, a membrane-bound nucleus. When it comes to size, prokaryotic cells are much smaller than eukaryotic cells. Again, the previous picture we saw that we were measuring nanometer scale, and then for much larger cells were micrometer size. So for prokaryotic cells, we're looking at 1 micron in diameter or less, and then for eukaryotic cells, they're from 10 to hundreds of micrometers long in diameter. The organization of prokaryotic cells, they're single-celled, so the whole organism is made up of one cell, unicellular organisms. Under prokaryotic cells, we have bacteria and archaea. And under eukaryotic cells, we mostly have multicellular organisms, cell organisms that are made up of many cells, like ourselves. And then when it comes to organelles, in prokaryotic cells, we only have one type of organelle. In eukaryotic cells, we have many types of organelles, and we'll explore that further in the second video. So why are prokaryotic cells so small? And why do eukaryotic cells, organisms, why do they have to be multicellular, made up of many cells? So why are cells small? Okay, let's start with this image here in the upper right-hand corner. We look at one cube. We have surface is 6. There's 6 surface areas, and then the volume is 1. So we could see that the surface area to volume ratio is 6. That's a lot of surface area for the volume of that individual cube. If we multiply this cube, and we see here with this, as we increase in size, imagine these are multiple cells, we see the surface area increased 24 to volume increased 8. The surface area to volume ratio, though, decreased. So there's less surface area to the volume that's increasing. And as we will see more of this when we look at picture C, we have a bigger cube or an organism that's even bigger, multicellular. We have the surface area 54, the volume 27, surface area to volume 2. So as we see that as that organism increases, as we add more cubes, the surface area to volume ratio decreases, which means that in a single cell, organisms are able to rely on simple diffusion, or I should just say diffusion, for material, things that they need, nutrients, to diffuse through the cell membrane and enter the cell where it needs to go in that space. But as we increase, then there's going to be less surface area for the same effect for materials that they need to enter the cell and to actually reach the center of the cell where it could be utilized. Likewise for excreting waste material. So cells have to be small because as they increase, they'll get too big for solely relying on diffusion to meet the needs of the cell. So prokaryotic cells that are less organized and have less organelles to carry out some of the eukaryotic cell function need to be even smaller because they lack these organelles to carry on the function of transport, etc. So we see that cells are quite small. On the left-hand side, we have a scale to show us how small cells are. And so we have smallest bacteria is going to be nanometers in size. That's a billionth of a meter. And you can see that here. 1 nanometer is a billionth of a meter. For size reference, if you have a yardstick, the meter is just roughly about the size of a yardstick. Okay, so then we're talking about smaller items than a yardstick. So nanometer would be a billionth the size of 1 yardstick. A micrometer would be a millionth the size of a yardstick, etc. Millimeter, milli is 1,000th, so 1,000th of a meter. Centi, 100th of a meter, and then we have the meter, the basic unit of the metric system for measuring length. So we have for smallest bacteria, nanometer size. Most bacteria, probably around 1 micron. We could go up to about, 5 microns. And then eukaryotic cells like plants and animal cells are within the 10 micron to 100 micron size. These are all in the yellow highlight, and yellow highlight means that these cells are visible with the use of a light microscope. We cannot see it with the naked eye, but we could view it with a compound light microscope. In order to appreciate the eukaryotic cell a little bit more, let's take a look at prokaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cell structure. Again, remember that these include bacteria and archaea, and their general structure is that they're smaller than eukaryotic cells. They have a cell wall that surrounds the cell membrane. This cell wall is made up of a peptidoglycan layer. And then if you look inside the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, you have the cytoplasm. There'll be ribosomes for protein synthesis. And then you'll have DNA in a general centralized region called the nucleoid, but the DNA is not bound in a membrane-bound nucleus. So how about eukaryotic cells? Let's look at eukaryotic. The eukaryotic cell. As we could see with this image, the eukaryotic cell is a lot more complicated than prokaryotic cells. Not all cells have all the organelles and structures depicted in this image, but just as an overview, we're going to go over the organelles that you'll find in eukaryotic cells. So we'll start with the nucleus. That is a very large structure. Under the light microscope, we're able to view that structure. The nucleus houses DNA, genetic material. And so inside the nucleus, we have a nucleolus. The DNA is in the nucleus. The nucleus is made up of this nuclear envelope, a membranous envelope that has pores. And this nuclear envelope is continuous with the rough endoplasmic reticulum, is seen in light blue. It's speckled with little dots. Those are ribosomes attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. The nucleus houses DNA. The rough endoplasmic reticulum modifies proteins. The ribosome produces proteins or synthesizes proteins. Continues with the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and it's called rough because of those ribosomes attached. We have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or SER. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum has the little or no ribosomes, and that is the site of lipid and carbohydrate synthesis. And then next to the smoother endoplasmic reticulum, we have the Golgi apparatus, also called the Golgi body. The Golgi apparatus or Golgi complex is more like the shipping center UPS of the cell, where we have proteins are going to be further modified, sorted, and shipped out of the cell. Other organelles include peroxisomes in the cytoplasm, lysosomes, lysosomal vesicles, and proximal vessels. We have the mitochondria, which is known as the powerhouse of the cell. That's where ATP synthesis takes place. So cellular respiration takes place in mitochondria. So all of these bean-shaped red structures are mitochondria, mitochondrion singular. Ribosomes attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, but we also have free ribosomes as well in the cytoplasm. We have the centrosome, which is part of the cytoskeletal elements or cytoskeletal system, and that's going to be important with cell division, so we'll discuss that a little bit more later on. And those are most of the structures located in the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm and everything between the nucleus, everything between the nucleus and the cell membrane. The eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane, and so this cell membrane is also called the plasma membrane. It's made up of phospholipid bilayer as well as proteins and cholesterol. And again, that'll be highlighted. We'll highlight the cell membrane in a future lecture as well. Attached to the cell membrane, we may see a flagellum. That's angular for flagella plural. So that's a whip-like structure made up of cytoskeletal proteins. And for some cells, we might see cilia, which are also made up of cytoskeletal proteins. Again, according to the structure, the function of the cell, we'll have these added structures. For example, cilia are going to be found along the respiratory tract in your trachea, lining the lumens. So when you inhale, the cilia is able to trap. Actually, there's the mucus that's secreted that traps inhaled particles or pathogens, anything that you inhale that shouldn't be in your body. The cilia move in unison, and you're able to move any junk that you just inhaled out, either spit it out or you swallow it, where the digestive enzymes will destroy things in the stomach. The flagellum, there's only one cell in the body that has a flagellum, and that's in the male body. So these are the structures that you may find in eukaryotic cells. This was an example of an animal eukaryotic cell. And so as you go through the lecture, you'll be able to see and identify the differences between eukaryotic cells and plant cells. And then you could also watch the video that compares the two. And so that's your cells, your introduction to cells. Thank you.